Hi, my name is Joe Williams, and I want to talk about the concept of race. Um, this is probably something I've thought about my entire life without actually realizing I was thinking about race. And as W.B. Du Bois said, it would the idea of race, or the issue of the color line, would be sort of the dominant issue of the 20th century. I think that it still is in the 21st century. As far as I know, the idea of race started with a French physician named Francois Bernier, and it was popularized in the book Natural Systems uh, by Carolus Linnaeus. And I think he believed there were about four or five different types of races. I actually saw his book, although it's written in Latin, so I couldn't read it. Um, but they had, I was just taking science classes at the University of Pennsylvania, and they had it in their rare book room. So I've always thought about race. And just recently, I got my 23andMe done, and I was something like 67% European, with like 26% Italian ancestry, but I also have ancestry from the Congo and Nigeria and Sierra Leone and Ghana, I believe. And for me, my 23andMe um, profile, or genetic makeup, really showed that I am a product of the slave trade. Of course, the idea of race um, has really caused so much death and destruction. For me, it's one of the worst ideas human beings have ever devised. And I mean, if you think about the fact that the Native American population was wiped out here on this continent, and in other countries as well, Australia, for example, and I mean we are a settler colonial um, country, and then you had slavery for, I don't know, 1619 until, was it 1863, 1865? Then slavery took another form in Jim Crow, and as Michelle Alexander points out, we have the new Jim Crow in the prison industrial system, and then we just had an overtly white supremacist president in Donald Trump. Um, uh, and Prior to him, we had the Tea Party, right? And I mean, they attempted to overthrow the government. I started thinking about race personally when I was about 5 years old. I remember, and it wasn't even, I didn't even consider it race. I remember being in New Orleans, Louisiana. My great grandmother, her name was Emily Pratt. Um, she was a darker skinned woman, and her daughter, Emily Pratt, was a lighter skinned woman, looked a little sort of Italian, had greenish eyes. And I remember, maybe I was 7 years old. I do remember that it was Easter, and I remember asking why my great grandmother was darker skinned than my grandmother, and I remember being told to go outside and play. And I think somebody gave me some chocolate, like put a chocolate bunny in my mouth to get me to shut up. And then I also noticed that on my father's side, my uncle Gary was substantially lighter than my father, And I always thought my mother was rather light skinned, and yet she identified as black. I went to a predominantly white school, the Episcopal Academy, and then I went to a much more multi ethnic uh, and also socially economically diverse school in Central High School of Philadelphia. And that was a really great, in some ways, a really interesting switch because I Central had pretty much the entire microcosm of humanity. I felt in one building: black, white, Latino, Asian, wealthy, uh, kids living below the poverty line, and they added girls in to the mix. And I learned, I think, there from 1983 to 1987 that human beings are pretty much the same. We're superficially different, but we are the same people. But I know that we're all sort of, and I would say even people of color are indoctrinated with white supremacy. I call it a kind of internalized white supremacy. And it's basically the idea that white people or whiteness means that you're smarter, means you're more attractive, and also means that you are moral. You're more moral than the people of color. And that's just not true. I mean, as we saw in Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, he's making the case. His thesis is that the reason why Europeans were able to dominate was because of three things: guns, germs, and steel. Now, it was really interesting because if you look at, in my opinion, some of the writings of W.B. Du Bois and let's say even Frederick Douglass, they both kind of allude to how they don't think there are really races of people. Maybe I'm misreading them. I think Frederick Douglass is kind of explicit about it. But then if you go back and look at the work of, say, Ashley Montagu and Franz Boas and that group over at Columbia University, I mean, look at almost any of Ashley Montagu's books, and he obliterates the idea of race. Because really, first of all, race, when the idea of race was first originated, Linnaeus really meant that there were like 4 or 5 distinct kinds of human beings who could not have children. That's where he came up with the idea of the mulatto, right? Which is really sort of the word mule or mulos, right? That if a white person, a black person, a child, then they would be sterile, right? But we know that's false. I mean, so you look at the impact of race. Like, first of all, as I said, I live here in Philadelphia. You have Native American names all over the place, right? The Manayunk River, the Passyunk, and where, however, are the Native American people? They've been mostly wiped out. Slavery, we're finally, scholars like Edward Baptiste, right, at Cornell University, wrote a great book called The Half That's Never Been Told. And he's looking at how slavery was much worse than scholars have recognized previously, right? And then you have scholars like historians like David Bryan Davis, Eric Foner. And I just became aware of Gerald Horne. and they go into depth about slavery and settler colonialism. And Gerald Horne's work is I just sort of became familiar with him in the last year, and he has a thesis in which he believes that the Revolutionary War was fought on the preservation of slavery, not just the Civil War. And so the country is really founded in this rather heinous concept of race. For me, the 20th century was really about I call it the grand unification of the human species. Right, as I mentioned, Ashley Montagu recognized there were no races of people, I believe in the 50s. And I think he gave a speech at the United Nations to that effect. Then you have my fellow Central High School alum, somebody who hated Central High School. He's more my father's age, a couple years younger, Noam Chomsky. I'm sure everybody's aware of who that is. But he found out that really language is our distinguishing characteristic, and that we have I don't even fully, be honest with you, understand this completely, but there's sort of one human language that has these generative. There's like a universal grammar, universal generative grammar, and that all these 6,000 or however many languages there are, they're all sort of different expressions of the same thing. In other words, you could take a baby from, say, Japan and put them in Sweden, and they're going to speak Swedish, right? I believe that's what they speak in Sweden, right? Or vice versa. You could take somebody from Sweden and you have them grow up in Japan, they'll speak Japanese. That's because we're the same people. And now Mark Hauser and John McKell and some other scholars are beginning to see that in the same way that language is universal, so is morality. Because again, we're the same people. Whether we want to be the same people or not is another story. Another thing is I found out, because I remember I read a book, not a book, actually an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I remember 1994, and I was waiting for my father who was getting some kind of surgical procedure, and I saw this article that says race is not a biological reality. Really, it's just skin deep. And they talked about the work in the article. They discussed the work of Kenneth Kidd. I believe he was a Yale biologist. Luigi Luca Cavalli Savorsa, who's now deceased, but he was a Stanford geneticist. And I went out and got their books. And Luigi Luca Cavalli Savorsa, I haven't read everything I got from him, but I think he had a book called Genes, Peoples, and Languages. And he was saying that we all are from Africa. We're all African, and we're very recently from Africa. And we've only changed superficially. And that Europeans were just a kind of African who had a vitamin D deficiency. Now, I'm not a geneticist. I'm not even a scientist. But I don't know if people still believe that. Again, I was referring to the 1990s. But I firmly believe, at least in my personal experience, and I've had all kinds of uh, experiences around race in my life, and it took me a long time to figure out, what exactly does it mean to be a black person? What does it mean to be a white person? What does it mean to be a black and white person? Because, like I said, I went to a school that was, I believe, I want to say all white and all male from 1785. I'm talking about the Episcopal Academy till maybe the 1960s. And I believe there were like 9 African Americans in my class. I had some racial experiences there. I have so many anecdotes. I'm gonna try to post about them too. And and in my experience, you can really see. I could really see how it's really subjective. Like depending on what people think you are, um, is how they treat you. Um, and so I'm gonna share them later. But one of the best books that I purchased was Kwame Anthony Appiah's book. Oh gosh, what's it called? Kwame Anthony Appiah and Amy Gutman wrote a book called Color Conscious: The Political Morality of Race. Now, Anthony Appiah is his parents. They made a movie about his parents, and I don't know how many people are old enough to remember it. I've actually never seen it. It was with Sidney Poitier called "Guess Who's Coming to Dinner." I think Appiah is Kenyan, or his father is either from Kenya or Ghana. I can't remember, but his mother was from England. And also, he's sorry, I just spilled my Coca-Cola, Diet Coke. Anyway, um, also he has a PhD in philosophy. He happens to be gay. Um, I thought he wrote perhaps one of the most brilliant books on race I've ever read. I also really appreciate the work of Dr. Stephen Jay Gould. Because I remember also in 1994, the Bell Curve came out, which suggested that, you know, black people are stupid. Basically, people of color are stupid, but especially black people. There's a, I mean, there's a long history of white supremacy and racism in Western civilization, but especially in psychology. And there's Stephen Jay Gould wrote a real indictment of the whole history of intelligence testing, and so did William H. Tucker. Now, he's not heard of at all, but he's a wonderful man. He used to teach at Rutgers University, Camden, and I remember I got his book. It was called "The Science and Politics of Racial Research." He copied the title after Leon Kamen. His book, "The Science and Politics of IQ." I have both of those books. I strongly recommend that book if you're interested in the topic of intelligence and race. Oh, Ashley Montague also had a book called Race and IQ. But Bill Tucker goes through the whole history. Then he has a book, I believe, on Raymond Cattell. I mean, you're talking about one of the most prominent psychologists of the 20th century. It's an indictment of him. And he also wrote a book on the Pioneer Fund, people who fund this kind of racial research. Uh, it's just magnificent work. And I just got a book by, well, not just got a book by Nell Irving Painter, The History of White People. That's also a fascinating topic, like uh, who exactly is white? You know, if I'm 67% European, does that mean I'm white? No, historically, we had the one drop rule, and I would strongly recommend her work too. Nell Irving Painter. Then you have so many greats. A Dreadful Deceit. I forgot who wrote that. Um, then I have two books. One is called The Race Myth, and I have another one I think called The Myth of Race, which is interesting. Um, then another person I would recommend is the late George Frederickson. He wrote books like White Supremacy, another book called Racism. And Noam wrote a great book too. I mean, Noam's written many great books, but like he has like something like 150 of them, 125, something. He's still putting out books uh, regularly at the age of 92, 93. But he has, I told him my favorite book was Year 501, where he goes from 1492 to what was the present at that time, whatever 501 is. Let's see, it'll be 1993. And he went through the entire history of Western civilization. But I mean, there's so, I mean, I know that now, we had Barack Obama as the president, and then there was a backlash, with the Trump presidency. I believe that was part of it, was a response to having Barack, Barack Obama break that barrier. I never thought I would ever see a non-white male president of the United States who also didn't, wasn't a Christian. But um, I think that caused a lot of fear. The country is becoming browner, right? And I think there's a lot of what I would call white anxiety about it. We have what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. One out of three black males is incarcerated, right? Um, and would that be because black males are particularly criminal? No. Although that would be part of the sort of white supremacist mentality, is to think that be the case. But no, I think there's something else going on. And if you look at Michelle Alexander, really blames Clinton largely on exploding the prison population. Uh, I don't, I'm not a member of the Democratic or the Republican Party. I did vote for Biden. I did vote for Bill Clinton. I did vote for Barack Obama, and I did not vote for Hillary. I thought she was going to win. I thought it was going to be a no-brainer. That's a whole nother issue I'd like to discuss is class and our political system. That's a whole nother issue. But race. So even though my position is, a lot of people say, "Oh, you don't believe in race," some people either think that's ludicrous, and other people think that, "Oh no, of course, obviously, there's no such thing as race. We all know that." To me, it was one of the biggest revelations of the 20th century, one of the biggest revelations of my life. I mean, how many millions of people? I mean, I think about the the Congo. How many 60 million people were killed. I think, I don't want to exaggerate, by King Leopold in Belgium. How many people in the Congo did they kill? How many lives were ruined in the Atlantic slave trade? There's another book um, called Ebony and Ivy, right? How the Ivy League was built on the slave trade, not just Brown University, all of them. Harvard is beginning to look at how they participated in the slave trade. It's deep. I mean, it's really deep. There's another great book that I have written by Harriet Washington, and it's about um, the medical profession. Now, I'm the son of a psychiatrist, and I have a lot of respect for medicine. And medicine has saved my life. I've But if you really get into the history of it, it's pretty ugly. I mean, it's really ugly. I mean, it's like Nazi-like ugly. Read her book, Harriet Washington, and Medical Apartheid. Uh, People would use slaves to experiment on. Um, the doctors, I mean, the whole history of gynecology, you know, uh, black women were used without anesthesia. Irish women were used. That's another topic is what's happened to the Irish. So look into that. Most of the philosophers, had a white supremacist perspective. Certainly Hegel. Uh, I actually have a book by Ivan Hannaford where he goes through the idea of race throughout philosophy. It's pretty ugly. I mean, if you want to really study anything, medicine, philosophy, psychology, or any field, really, you're going to have to deal with white supremacy. If you were alive during the Trump presidency, to me, it's right underneath the surface, and I'm going to share about some of the experiences I've had. Little anecdotes, like when I was I worked in a neurology lab, and one of the, he wasn't the primary investigator, but he's from England. He and I were walking to get some of the animals, or I think we are putting animals away. And he said, "Can you go in my pocket and get my key?" And I did. And he said, "Well, that's not the first time a black man has had his hands in a white man's pocket." Now, I wasn't thinking about race at all, but he introduced it. And then I said, "Wow, I made some comment about the sun never setting on England." And he said, "Oh, wow, 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 why are you getting upset? What, you know, that's another issue. This idea that if you, for some reason, bring up racism, you're the problem, actually. It's not the racism itself that's the problem, but you're the problem." Um, and then I want to talk about a case that's very disturbing to me, and that is what Israel's doing to the Palestinians. I've lost friends over commenting on this topic. It's really interesting to me, and I look at the work of Norman Finkelstein and Ilan Pappé, Noam Chomsky again, and Sarah Roy, and you name it. Right after probably the worst, most racist, hate-filled episode of the 20th century, of course, had to be Adolf Hitler and his murdering of 6 million Jewish people, right? I think just by the speed with which he did it. And, now that's a really interesting story too, because I got a book by a Yale law school professor on how the Nazis really learned from the United States, but in fact thought that the U.S. went too far in terms of race laws, miscegenation type laws. And it's also interesting to see that there's and I have another book, the IBM connection. So of course it was horrifying. It was just a horrifying event. The Holocaust, certainly. But what really baffles me is that right after the Holocaust, Israel turned around and engaged in the Nakba. Now, what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is not, it's not the Holocaust, but it is dehumanizing, right? And to me, as a minority myself, and given as much as Jewish people have suffered, and they have, like I'm against anti-Semitism, and also I'm also against hurting the Palestinian people in the name of Israel. That's a problem. Then you have, like I said, Joe Biden. It's great that he has Kamala Harris, and he was Barack Obama's vice president and buddy. But he, just go to YouTube and look at some of his videos from the 90s. He and Bill Clinton, strongly supported the incarceration of so many black people, black and brown skinned people. And we're not supposed to question that. You're supposed to think about that. You're not supposed to talk about that. And, he talked about using crack cocaine and how he doesn't care. He has no sympathy, if you had a hard life or whatever, unless, of course, it's his son. And then he has sympathy there. There's no jail time for his son. But so my point is that there are no races of human beings. We're all African. We're more or less identical, which is a phrase that Noam Chomsky used. And yet, don't mistake in that to mean, I don't mean that there's no such thing as racism. Of course, there's racism. And of course, there's a deeply ingrained white supremacist ideology in our country. And hopefully, we're going to overcome it. I think internalized a lot of white supremacist thinking, being told, light skin is better. If you, I was told that I had good hair. Of course, my good hair has fallen out. And actually, I do think, like, if you do have lighter skin, and I think this applies in India and many Latino cultures, lighter skin is always preferential. Now, maybe that's going to change, as I said, as the country gets browner. But I do know one of the things that I've learned is that we really are the same people. People of color are not less intelligent. The people of color are not less moral. People of color are not less beautiful. And we are all just very superficially different. And that's one of the lessons that I've learned in life. I have another, there's so many great books on race and the idea of race and the end of the idea of race. There's another guy who's in England. I can't think of his name at the moment, but I just start getting his books too. And I just wish that we would act accordingly. We say we don't. A lot of people say they don't believe in race, but as I said, we just elected, to me, and a guy who admitted, he said he is a nationalist. This very thinly veiled, coded language like "Make America Great Again." Obviously, what is that about? So I'm hoping that we can really live like we're the same people. And for me, it's interesting. I remember I was reading Paul Krugman, and I think in his book, the Conscience of a Liberal, and he was saying, in his view, and this is kind of a relatively old book, but he was saying that in his view, the reason we didn't have universal health care was because of racism. And he went back to Ronald Reagan, and he had ads about socialized medicine. This fear, and even we just saw that $10,000, maybe $20,000 was canceled um, by Biden for student loan debt. This whole idea of solidarity, which the late Paul Farmer talked about as the greatest human value, uh, the idea that you're doing things for you're doing things for others, and that they are others, that they are not your people, I think is one of the reasons we don't have a lot of social safety nets here in the United States. I agree with Paul Krugman, in that probably that's the reason. I mean, even though it would be cheaper, right, to have universal health care, that and greed, I would argue. And I want to talk about that. Corporations, corporate greed, the fact that corporations own our government. That's a huge problem. And there's a racial component to corporations. Uh, I I forgot the well. Uh, Morton Horowitz, the late Morton Horowitz, who was a Harvard Law School professor, he wrote a two volume tome on it's called The Transformation of American Law, where he explains how corporations gained rights of eternal humans. But this other guy, I can't think of his name, UCLA law school professor, Adam Winkler, I think, his book's called We the Corporations. He explains how corporations started off by gaining the rights of freed slaves, right? So there's kind of a correlation there too. There's an interesting correlation with the Second Amendment, right? Uh, an Emory professor wrote a good book about that. Actually, there's a lot of great books written on that topic. She particularly looks at race and the Second Amendment. I think there should definitely be reparations. Uh, I think we should have universal health care. I think we should have free college. I think that the United States should seriously make amends for slavery. First of all, I don't even know if that's possible. I remember John Hope Franklin um, had a very nuanced position on, reparations, but Randall Robinson, if I remember correctly, in his book *The Debt*, he recommended, I think the figure was $9 trillion for reparations. Um, maybe if it's not cash, maybe if we did have social safety net, maybe if we did have Medicare for all, spent it on instead of these wars in the military industrial complex. If we did spend it on education and positive things, or maybe just 40 acres and a mule, I don't know. Um, there should be some kind of reparations for the transatlantic slave trade, because it was huge and the impact was real, and we still are living with it today. And I know we don't like to think about critical race theory or history in general, but is pretty ugly. It's almost hard for me to imagine how much bloodshed and misery there's been in this country and in Western civilization, largely based on this concept of race. Um, I was just talking to somebody the other day, like we dropped atom bombs on Japan, but not on Germany. Was there a racial element to that? I think so, certainly. I mean, I can't even imagine atomic bombs being dropped in the middle of Europe or anywhere in Europe. In Germany, which was, I mean, we have so many German Americans here. Um, I remember German American POWs were treated better than returning African American soldiers who were in segregated units. No, we never would have dropped the atomic bomb on Germany. Racism, white supremacy permeates still in the year 2022 almost every aspect of our society. It is deeply ingrained, and unless that we reckon with it in a serious way, it doesn't go away. It's not going to go away. Um, and you saw it with the Trump presidency. I mean, people when Obama was elected, people were saying, "Well, we're post-racial. We don't have to think about this anymore." Then we did a complete turnaround, um, and went with an overtly white supremacist president. And it's not over. We may be going right back, if not to Trump, maybe to Ron DeSantis or somebody of that ilk. Because you're talking about 70 million voters. And I'm not saying they're all racist, but they don't mind or they don't recognize uh, that they aligning with an utterly racist individual. And there's real effects to this concept, even though it is a concept and it has an origin. It's had very real impact on the world, and we all know it. And I would like to share like personal anecdotes about how it affected me, which I will in subsequent videos. Thank you very much.